Hello and welcome to the 43rd edition of Half Hour, a podcast starring me, John Paulo Giudice, as your host. In today's episode, I will discuss the Manchester punk music scene in the 70s and 80s with Tess, Slavíčková. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Hi.
Really
Hi.
appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, anytime. So if you want to just begin by telling, the audience a little about yourself, maybe what you're doing in Prague, maybe like your education or just your background in general, or...
Okay. So I'll just talk a little bit about how I came to be here, and then I'll go back to the past because that's what I want to talk about really. So I've been here now for more than 30 years. So I came here in 1991. My first job here was at, my main job here was at the British Council. I worked as a journals editor. We published a journal for teacher trainers here. This was early period, post 1989. There was a lot of aid money for education projects and that kind of thing. And it was quite an exciting time. So that was my first job, and then I worked, I came here actually. I had a couple of children in between, and then I started working here in 2001, yes, just after 9/11 I started here at UNEP. So I've been at UNEP ever since. I teach in the communication and media department, so I teach courses such as Introduction to Communication, Research Methods, and Intercultural Communication.
Okay, very nice.
Yeah.
What would you say, brought you here? Did Czech Republic just kind of speak to you, or was it...
Well, two things. I'd been working as a book editor in Oxford and not liking it, and the second thing was romance. I met my husband, and he's Czech, and I wasn't happy in Oxford for lots of reasons, so I thought, well, I'll come and work here. And actually my first ever job, which was just for a short time, was teaching in a company, teaching English to business people in a company, and then I started at the British Council. So that was what brought me here really, and I have no regrets. It's been fine. It's been great.
Yeah, Czech Republic's great. I really like Prague. I've said it many times, I think in many different episodes, but I really like Prague. I think it's a really enchanting city.
It gets into your soul, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, so if we're gonna dive into the topic a little bit, I'd love for you to provide, definitely me, but also the viewers, with some context. Like what do you need to know about the Manchester punk scene as someone who doesn't?
Okay. Well, what you need to know is that historically, popular music is a very complex phenomenon, and you start investigating one genre and you realize that these genres are not kind of self-contained, right? So everything comes out of something else, everything is linked to something else. But the punk scene kind of emerged very suddenly, very rapidly in, I think, the sort of mid-1970s. Mainly in the United States, but also particularly in London with the Sex Pistols. I missed out on that. I was way too young for that scene. But I certainly knew about it. There were lots of alarmist reports in the press about this punk movement that was destructive, that was dangerous, that was full of bad people who were going to smash up the system and destroy everything. And of course, the punks kind of warmed to that. They thought that was great. They thought that was a really good representation of what they were trying to do. So they certainly didn't fight back against that. So that was happening in the sort of second half of the 1970s. This is happening alongside other sort of musical genres, if you like, that were more established, particularly, what is now known, or was probably known then, as progressive rock. Mm-hmm. These were bands that were generally very well equipped, let's say. They had a lot of gear. They had all the, possible technology at their disposal. And they were producing these very expensive, very high concept albums. And, they did a bit of touring. I think I went to see one band when I was about 14 in Manchester that was, progressive rock, a German band, I think. And I remember it took me about 10 minutes before I could actually see the musicians. There was so much equipment on the stage. And I felt very kind of distanced from these people. Music was okay. There was a light show. There was lasers. This was all very new. But it was, there was no kind of interaction with the audience at all. Mm-hmm. The audience just sat there listening to it. No response, really, just polite applause. So these bands were, they were very wealthy. They did their touring. They obviously sold a lot of records. So they were doing well. And then there was the sort of disco scene, ABBA, bands like that, people dressed in sort of glittery costumes. So there was that kind of stuff going on. And then sort of punk arrived in the middle of it with a very different approach, very different attitude, which was much more, it was much more sort of in your face. It was much more sort of audience oriented. Mm-hmm. And to me, as a teenager, still at school, it was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to me. And I come from a small town north of Manchester in a sort of small valley. It's about 20 miles away from Manchester. But in those days, 20 miles, that's nothing, right? Mm-hmm. But in those days, 20 miles was very, very far.
Yeah.
I would go as a child, I would go into Manchester with my mom and she'd take me to the ballet or the opera or something like that. But it was always, a special occasion. The idea of going into Manchester and hanging out or going shopping, for me, that just didn't happen. There were buses that would take you there, but they were very slow and they took a very long time to get there. And they were expensive. So, Manchester seemed like a world away. Mm-hmm. So anyway, when I was at school and I was, as teenagers do, I was trying to connect with people who felt like me. And, gradually we sort of formed a group of like-minded people, if you like. Mm-hmm. At that time, I think this is how it's different from today, music was very tribal. Mm-hmm. When I look at how young people listen to music today, Spotify, streaming.
It's very easy to access.
Yeah. And so you listen to a song, you like it, and then on the basis of that, you'll be recommended something else that's similar, right? Mm-hmm. A similar band or a similar genre of music. When I was, starting to get into music, it was very different. So if you were a punk, that was all you listened to. Mm-hmm. And you hated everything else. And so it became this very tribal phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So, all the punks stuck together, all the heavy metal people stuck together, all the northern soul people stuck together. That was another interesting subgenre. The disco people. So it was very sort of kind of fragmented, if you like. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it made you feel that you had some kind of identity. So that identity was defined by the music you listened to. And I don't know if that happens so much now. Yeah?
I don't think so. I mean, to that degree, I don't think. I mean, the ease of accessing music now is so incredible. I mean, in the past you had to go get a CD or you had to go get a tape before that.
Yeah.
You had me thinking about how before the audiences didn't really interact much with the performer. I know that Queen, like specifically, like made like a lot of strides. I don't think they're punk rock, but like
No. No, we would have no, we did hate them.
Oh, you did?
But yes. Yes, they were sort of glam rock, you know.
Oh, okay.
So
like pop kind of.
yeah,
like everyone
but
listened to them.
I think even then I appreciated that they were doing something different. So I respected Queen then at the time, but they just weren't my genre. That wasn't what I was listening to. So it was a very tribal thing, and in our student lounge at school, by that time I was in the sixth form, so we had a special student lounge like here, but not before then. And there was a record player, and you know, in the break times there'd be a sort of fight to see which band, which gang would get there first and put their record on. So it was, you know, it was all, I think, pretty good-natured. There was never any aggression about it. But I think for me, the real turning point came, I was trying to remember which year it was. I was still at school, so it might have been, I know it was the winter, 1979, Christmas, something like that. And I had a friend who was quite a bit older than me, and somehow, I don't know how, but I persuaded him to take me into my school friends to see a concert in Manchester. And he was a kind of Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen kind of guy. But he agreed, and to this day, I really am very grateful to him, and he's never forgotten this evening either. So anyway, so me and my two friends got in the car with John, and we drove off to this place, and it was a club called, well, it had two names. At the time, it was called the Russell Club. And it was in a kind of what you would call a suburb of Manchester, which historically is an interesting place in itself.
Is it near London, or is it further north?
It's a lot further north. It's
like, I'm trying to think, like near Liverpool, or still further?
Yes, it is near. Well, yes, it's on the same sort of latitude as Liverpool, more or less.
All right.
But it's further east. So Liverpool's on the west coast. It's very close to the coast. Manchester's a bit more inland. It takes about an hour, less than an hour on the train from Manchester.
To get from one to the other.
Yeah. But, you know, again, in those days, they were very different. So, of course, the music scene in Liverpool was dominated by the Beatles, right? But by the time I was listening to music, the Beatles had split up. For us, they were history.
Yeah.
They were of no interest. We only listened to the music of the time, pretty much, yeah? So the Beatles were of no interest at all because they were gone. So anyway, so we went to this club in a place called Hume, which is just outside. It's just outside the centre of Manchester. It's pretty close. And Hume itself was an interesting place. I remember when I told people that we were going to this club in Hume, they'd say, "Oh, go on, be careful. It's really dangerous. You know, make sure you lock your car and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Don't leave anything inside the car." You know, people were kind of warning us what a lawless place it was. But Hume itself was quite interesting because it had, you know, Manchester itself had been at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution, right? It had made itself very wealthy during the Industrial Revolution, but by the late 20th century, that had all come to an end. So the cotton factories were closed, the shoe factories were closed, all the sort of industries on which Manchester had based its wealth were gone, because they'd gone to, cotton manufacturing had gone to India and, other places. So Manchester was very heavily bombed in the Second World War.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yes, it was. So there were large parts of Manchester then that were, just bomb sites. There was just nothing there, just some weeds growing. So it took a long time, I think, for Manchester to regenerate. So at that time, in the late 70s, 80s, it was pretty bleak. Manchester doesn't have the greatest weather. It's often grey, it's often raining. If you saw the football yesterday, Manchester City won the treble and there was big celebration, but it was pouring with rain.
Yeah, but they're out there celebrating.
They were out there celebrating. No, they don't care. They don't care because that's normal.
Yeah, the football can be very intense.
That's
or soccer as we call it, but
the soccer, that's another thing. So it doesn't have the best climate. It was, in those days, it was sort of grey, it was dirty, it was very poor. This place, Hume, had been one of these very poor working class areas that were demolished after the Second World War. There'd been these sort of very small terraced houses. And I remember places like that in the town where I lived that were eventually demolished because they were very small, they were very unhygienic, and they had no indoor toilets.
Oh my God.
There was a toilet at the end of the street, right?
Wow.
For the whole street. So I remember some of these places, but Hume was demolished. I don't know. I had no awareness of this. And then they built these concrete blocks of flats. This was supposed to be the future, the modern future.
Yeah.
But what happened was that the people who'd lived in these small streets, what would be known as slums, they had a community. Everybody knew each other. Everybody trusted each other. And suddenly that way of life was gone, and it was replaced by this sort of high-rise living. And so all of these social problems that were happening in and around Manchester were due to this drastic policy of replacing poor working class housing with modern housing that was worse. Basically, it was worse, and it kind of separated communities and families.
So all of what you're saying kind of really spoke to affect the kind of soul of this city. Like the bombings, the evacuation of the industrial kind of potential there. The new housing that took out kind of like the old roots there. So you'd say that those things really helped kind of create the environment needed for this scene.
Definitely. There's no question.
And so the music scene kind of evolved out of that. Okay.
Yeah. So this first gig I went to, that I would call punk or post, probably you'd call it post-punk. There were 3 bands in this small club, the Russell Club. And I remember walking through the door, and I had just seen people that I had never seen anything like these people before. They had safety pins through their noses, they had wild coloured hair, some of them were wearing sort of trash can bin liners for clothing, just the most exotic creatures I had ever seen, and it just blew my mind. And and it was a small place, but it was just full of these exotic people, and the bands were great. I really enjoyed the gig. There was a bit of spitting. It was very fashionable. There was a phase during the punk phase where members of the audience would spit at the band, which was
Oh my God.
horrible.
That's gross.
Yes, that was gross.
Did they get the loogies going too? Like,
yeah.
Oh my God.
That was
That's-
really, yeah. So I
that's
saw
diabolical.
that. I saw that a few times. Luckily, it kind of fizzled out. It was horrible.
What was the why did they start doing that? Like,
I don't
did
know.
the band want it? Like-
No, the band didn't. I mean, it was a health hazard. There were
Yeah.
certain, there were cases of people getting hepatitis and, infections as a result. So nobody wanted it. And sometimes the band would go off and they'd say, look, we're not going to play, and they would disappear. And then they'd come back on again. And usually it was like a small number of people in the audience. And they thought they were expressing their gratitude, their affection for the band. It was kind of an expression of, it was supposed to be something positive, but it was horrible. So anyway, so this just going to this concert completely turned my life around musically, and I started. So one of the bands of the three, I think two of the three are still. If you listen to post-punk or this kind of music, they're not that unfamiliar names. One of them, Magazine, that was the sort of top rated, the top band of the three. I went out and I bought their albums, and I still listen to their music today. They had evolved, Magazine had evolved from another band called the Buzzcocks that are today probably more famous and more familiar name. And I saw the Buzzcocks as well many times. So that kind of started me on the path of going to gigs and, listening to this kind of music. And it was interesting because in my small town where I came from, I don't think there were certainly none of the bigger name bands ever came there. But I didn't go to many gigs in Manchester either, because Manchester was so far away, and unless you did know somebody who would drive you, and my friend John never did it again, he just did it that once. So unless you had somebody to drive you, it was very difficult. So most of the time we went to gigs in smaller towns outside Manchester, places like Bolton, Bury, Blackburn. These are kind of smaller industrial towns as well.
Very English sounding.
Very English sounding names. And they were a bit easier to get to and from. The only problem, and this was a major issue for us, the only problem was what time's the last bus home? We had to get home. What time's the last bus? So every evening was structured around, okay, so how much time do we have here?
Yeah.
And there were many occasions when I don't think we ever missed the last bus. I don't think we ever had to walk all the way from somewhere like Blackburn, which would have been about 15 miles.
Oh, wow.
But there were many occasions we managed to get sort of 3/4 of the way, and then we would have to walk the last few miles. And that was fun, especially if you had school in the morning.
I kind of know what that's like a little, because I did some hiking here, and there was always a worry about missing the bus, and it did happen. I had someone I was with where I got down the mountain first, and I was trying to hold the bus driver up, and he decided to just leave. I mean, it was his prerogative. The time was to go, and my friend wasn't there, so I had to wait. So yeah, I totally get it when it's like you have to structure it around like how much time you have.
Yeah. No, that was a big issue. So sometimes we did miss. We didn't. I mean, this was another thing about punk bands. They didn't usually play very long sets. So they'd usually be done after about 45 minutes, an hour. So usually you could get the last bus. But there was one occasion I remember very vividly, and it was later it became a very sad occasion, and that was because the band, you may have heard of this band, the band that were playing, and this was in a venue in Bury, which is a small town nearish to Manchester. The band were called Joy Division. Have you heard of them?
I have not. I can't say.
All right. So this band were called Joy Division, and they were really on the up at the time. This was spring 1980, and Joy Division were becoming more and more widely known outside the sort of Manchester circuit. They came a little bit later than some of the bands that I was listening to, like Magazine, but they had this fanatical following. They were absolutely adored. And the singer was a guy called Ian Curtis, who his act was something that you would never forget. He had this manic kind of dance. You know, he was completely, he certainly was, he did connect a bit with the audience, but not that much. He was in his own world when he sang. And very, very intense, very dark lyrics. And it was really something to see. And I saw them maybe 2 or 3 times. And on this occasion, there was a problem. And there was a support band. So there was another band who were on before. Everybody was waiting for Joy Division, and nothing happened. And then eventually, the support band came back on. And they started playing. And they were fine, they were okay, but that wasn't what people had come to see. And nobody said anything. There was no explanation as to why Joy Division hadn't come onto the stage, why they weren't playing. And eventually, and everybody's going, I have to get last bus home. And suddenly, a riot broke out, and people started throwing beer glasses, chairs, and it just became chaos within seconds. And that was the only really scary moment. And
it was all because they didn't come on to play?
It was all because they didn't come on to play, and nobody tried to explain why. And the explanation is a really sad one. Ian Curtis, 10 days after that happened, they never played that day. 10 days after that, he committed suicide.
Oh, my God.
And it turned out, and there have been, people have written books about him, and they've written about his life. There have been films. There was a documentary film about him. There have been 2 sort of acted films, one of which is called Control. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's a really, really good film.
Okay.
Control, directed by Anton Corbijn, who was a photographer and took a lot of photos of the band.
Okay.
So what happened was that Ian Curtis was this really kind of interesting man, as lots of them were. They were often, they didn't go to university, but they were self-taught. They read a lot, philosophy, literature. They knew a lot about stuff, and that was reflected in the songs that they wrote. And Ian Curtis was also an epileptic. He had epilepsy. And at that time, it wasn't widely understood, and it wasn't very well treated.
Yeah.
So he was under some kind of medication for it, but he wasn't taking it because it didn't go very well with alcohol and late nights and that kind of lifestyle. So on several occasions, I think before he got on stage, he had an epileptic episode. And so it happened on that night. same thing, backstage. And instead of somebody coming out and saying, look, he's been taken ill, we're really sorry, we'll refund the money, whatever.
They just didn't do it.
They didn't say a word. There was no, in those days, there was no PR, there was no, there was no kind of sense that you had to explain anything.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, it was so chaotic, it was so bad that nobody even thought about it. They were concerned about him and his welfare.
Mm-hmm.
So that was.
How long did they have you guys waiting? Like before that kind of like riot broke out? Was it like an hour or two? Was it longer?
I don't know. It felt like a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
But it probably wasn't because, as I say, there was a support band and they were playing and then they went away. But then very shortly after they came back on again. I think that night we did get the last bus home.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't know anything. We were a bit annoyed. My friends and I just sort of escaped through a side door.
I see.
So we got out. So I think, we can't have waited that long because we did make the bus. Mm-hmm. So that meant that we can't have waited that long. But, people just didn't know what was happening and nobody explained anything. So
I feel like that's, even in the time period of it being kind of like, oh, whatever, like back then, I feel like even then, like you should have someone come out and say something, because that's it's important. I mean, if people, are spending their time there, the money's important too, but I feel like the time is like very important.
Yeah.
Like you got to be respectful of people's time. They should have, I guess they should have told somebody.
They should have. But, maybe it was chaos backstage and
Mm-hmm.
nobody thought about it until, it was too late. So, that was a really upsetting moment for me.
So from what I've gathered, we're kind of reaching the end.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to leave him with a statement, you can, but I'm just thinking like,
Okay.
what I'm gathering from this is it's a very like, it's quite the crazy scene sometimes, like there's people who, maybe they're drunk and they're throwing things, and then you witness that against the backdrop of a city that kind of, lost its soul in a few different ways, and it's kind of looking for its identity, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I think Manchester, like any big city, it has and always had multiple identities.
Mm-hmm.
It's changed beyond recognition. Some of the old, like the Russell, before I finish, the Russell Club was key to this whole thing because it became what was known as the Factory. And the Factory, and I remember seeing this guy at the Russell Club when I was there. There was a guy standing at the back listening, and I thought, I know this guy, I've seen him before. And I'd seen him on TV. He was a newsreader on local Manchester television. Mm-hmm. And this guy was absolutely pivotal to the Manchester scene. He was a guy called Tony Wilson. And he ran the Russell Club. He ran the sort of punk nights at the Russell Club. And then it became the Factory. And the Factory then generated Factory Records. It then evolved into a record company. Mm-hmm. And they produced a lot of the records that were part of that scene, that not just Manchester, but mainly the Manchester scene. Mm-hmm. And those records were, they're a work of art. If you ever get a chance to look at Factory Records portfolio, they didn't just do records, they did other kinds of publications and posters, and they were really, really beautifully done. Mm-hmm. And Tony Wilson kind of masterminded all of these bands and all of these things going on culturally in Manchester. Obviously as a news person, he had millions of contacts. Mm-hmm. And that really, not just in terms of the music, but just culturally in general, sort of brought this whole scene alive. And, you know, Manchester never went back to being the industrial city that it had been. You know, like most of England, Manchester became, you know, the sort of money-making industries were what you'd call service industries, entertainment and hospitality and so on, and football. There's so much football money that has gone into the city of Manchester. You know, they've built these huge skyscraper buildings and, you know, it's been completely modernised. And a lot of that modernisation has come from sort of investment to do with Manchester City or Manchester United football clubs. So, you know, so Manchester is now transformed. It's a completely different place. And please don't, you know, I've said that it's dark and it's bleak and it's raining, but don't let that put you off. It is a great town. There's so much to do. There's so much to see. It's the friendliest place you could imagine.
Okay.
And it has an awful lot going for it. And it isn't far from Liverpool, but of course, you know, at the time they were worlds apart when I was growing up. So there's lots to do in that part of the country and lots of places to go. But you can do a musical tour of Manchester. So there are people who organise little groups of people to visit, you know, some of the clubs and the venues, if they're still standing. The Russell Club's long gone. The Hacienda, which, have you heard of the Happy Mondays? These were 80s bands. Oh, okay.
I'm bad with that stuff.
Okay, so a lot of these places are now demolished or they've been turned into luxury flats or whatever. But you can still kind of tour around some of... Have you heard of the Smiths? Oh.
Yeah, I'm bad. I'm really bad.
No, you're American. It's okay.
Yeah.
You're forgiven. So, yeah, so a lot of these places you can still see and you get a sense of what the city used to be. But it's a very different place today. It's certainly a lot cleaner and a lot more sort of, you know, kind of walker-friendly. There are nice places down by the river. The river's been cleaned up. The canals have been cleaned up. So it's a good place to visit.
So there you have it.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank
I appreciate it.
I enjoyed it.
All right, guys. Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.